Let's talk feeding ratios and how extremely important it is to understand feeding ratios and what they mean, and to prevent your starter from turning acidic, okay, and weak. All right, so let's get into it. Let's get into what exactly does feeding ratios mean, okay? It's pretty basic. In your jar, you have 1 part starter, a certain percentage of water, and a certain percentage of flour in there, okay? What that means is your starter, hence lactic acid bacteria and wild yeast, needs to be fed, needs to eat, so it can keep pollinating and producing, starter that you can bake with, okay? So just remember, your starter needs food. The food is the water and flour, okay? To exist, to keep growing, to keep colonizing, okay? So I'm not going to drag this video on forever and ever. I just want to give you the most basic terms of understanding what it is. Okay, so let's break it down, okay? If you are feeding your starter this, which means equal parts starter, equal parts water, equal parts flour, hence you're feeding it a 1-to-1-to-1, okay? That's what you feed your starter every day, okay? Let's break this down. When you feed your starter a 1-to-1-to-1 every single day, that means your starter and your jar on your counter that you maintain is going to peak in 4 to 6 hours, meaning it's going to turn into active yeast to bake with. And then it is going to take it about 2 hours to fall from the peak. Meaning, if you don't want your starter to turn to acidic acid and you want to keep the lactic acid, you're going to have to feed your starter that you feed every day, every 8 hours or 3 times a day. This is what all this means. All it means is your starter took 4 to 6 hours to eat all of its food. And because you fed it such a low ratio or equal parts, it's starting to starve out after 2 hours. And once it goes its tummy is completely dry, bone dry, it will turn acidic. The lactic acid turns into acidic acid, okay? Meaning, hence, weak starter, okay? So there's nothing wrong if you want to have a big, huge jar of starter on your counter and feeding it a 1-to-1-to-1 equal parts, as long as you're feeding it 3 times a day. Meaning you're dumping out, equal parts of the, your starter, whatever you're doing with it, and you're putting in equal parts water, equal parts flour, that's fine. If you want to feed it that way, just remember you have to feed it 3 times a day, or it will turn acidic. Your lactic acid will turn into acidic acid. All right, let's get into this one. Let's say you are feeding your starter a 1-to-5-to-5 ratio. What does that mean? That means in your jar, you have one part of this is starter, 5 parts of this is water, and 5 parts of this is flour. Okay? Meaning your starter is going to take 8 to 10 hours to peak, hence turn into active yeast. And because this is a moderate feeding and it's not quite, it's not a huge amount of food for your starter to eat, it's also going to start falling in about 2 to 3 hours. So because you fed it a moderate amount of food, it's going to need to be fed again in 12 hours from the time you fed it. Every day when you're feeding it 12 hours or twice a day. Okay? Because if you don't feeding it a 1-to-5-to-5 twice a day, your lactic acid is going to turn into acidic acid. Okay? You still have yeast. It's just you're not going to cook a good loaf of bread if you don't continually feed your starter enough food and water to exist. Okay? So let's move on. There's nothing wrong with this. If you want to keep this big jar on the counter and feed it a 1-to-5-to-5 or 1-to-2-to-2 or, however you want to do, just remember you have to feed it a 1-to-5-to-5 twice a day. Otherwise, it's going to turn acidic and you're not going to be able to make a good loaf of bread, okay? All right, let's get into this one. This is the cream of the crop right here, okay? This is how I feed my small stiff starter. This is what I'm baking with today. I have a very small starter that only holds 63 grams of active peak starter a day. I only feed it once a day. So let's get into it. If you have a big jar on your counter, which is fine, if you want to keep that and you want to use that much flour and starter and all those good things, that's perfectly fine. Let's get into this feeding ratio. When you're feeding it a 1 to 10 to 10, that means in this big jar, you have 1 part starter, hence lactic acid and wild yeast. You have 10 parts of this is going to be the water, and another 10 parts of that is going to be the flour, hence the food that your lactic acid and your yeast need to survive, okay? Since you fed this such a large amount of food and had a low amount of your wild yeast and your lactic acid in there, it's going to take 12 to 14 hours to peak. And then it's because you fed it such a huge amount of food, it's going to take 12 hours to fall. So you only have to feed this every 24 hours because there's, 24 hours in a day. It takes 12 to 14 hours to peak and then another 12 hours to fall. So 12 and 12 is what? 24. So you only have to feed your starter once a day for it to prevent it from turning into acetic acid. And that's it. That's feeding ratios in a nutshell. There's really no wrong way to feed your starter as long as you know how many times a day to feed it. That's it. That's all feeding ratios are. It's how much food are you giving your wild yeast and lactic acid to colonize itself throughout the day. That's it. And ferment. How much food are you giving it to ferment and become active yeast to bake with? That's the food. Feeding ratios are nothing more than the amount of food that you are giving your starter. That's all it is. And once you can learn what feeding ratio you like best, then you can do that. Everybody says, oh, 1 to 1 to 1. It's so bad. It's not bad if you do that same process 3 times a day. If you want to spend 3 times a day feeding your big, gigantic Mount St. Helens jug, that's fine. If you want to feed it a 1 to 5 to 5 twice a day, you guys, that's absolutely healthy. So is this 1 to 1 to 1 3 times a day. But this right here, this 1 to 10 to 10, is what I prefer to do because my starter will always be strong. It will always be fed. It will always be obedient, and it will always make me a wonderful loaf of bread every time I bake because my lactic acid did not turn into acetic acid. And that's it. You have to remember lactic acid and wild yeast are merging into one. They're like one entity. They're colonizing each other, and there's always a push and pull with them, but they have to coexist together in an evenly balanced diet, hence food. And if you're throwing their diet off, your yeast enjoys your lactic acid, which lactic acid is just basically what makes your sourdough taste sour, okay? But they like each other. And if you break that family up and you turn this into acetic acid, your yeast isn't happy because it lost its buddy. That's how I'm going to end this video. It lost its buddy. Oh my gosh. This is just feeding ratios in a nutshell for you, okay? This is how I understand it, okay? Believe you me, I used to do this when I first started. I used to dump half out into the garbage and put a cup of flour and barely a little bit of water and stir it into that thick pancake batter. My starter always stunk and it was always weak. My loaves would come up a little bit, but they'd never be those big, huge, springy loaves. It's because my starter was always acidic. I wasn't feeding it 3 times a day, and nobody ever told me that. Never once did I find a video of somebody saying, if you want to do a 1 to 1 to 1, you got to feed it 3 times a day. Because if I would have found out about the 1 to 10 to 10, I would have done that from the beginning instead. Just did 1 part starter, 10 parts water, 10 parts flour. And if you guys still are kind of lost on what the parts mean, you guys just, I have a video. It's called, I forgot what it's called. It breaks down how I take a certain percentage out of my small stiff starter and I turn it into Mount St. Helens in 1 feeding. And go watch it. It's a great way of, showing you how kind of the math works. That's all it is. If you're still kind of lost and you're like, okay, well, what does that mean? Whatever your amount of starter, let's take this as an example. Whatever the amount of starter that's in your jar, times that by 10. And that's how much water you need to put in it. Whatever amount of starter that you have in your jar, times that by 10. Like, let's say in my jar right now, let's say there's, I don't know, 10 grams. Okay. That means I'm going to have to feed it 100 grams of water and 100 grams of flour, 1, 10, 10, etc. It's kind of an example. But yeah, that's feeding ratios in a nutshell. You're basically timesing, just like this one. Whatever your starter comes out to be, you just times that by 5, and that'll give you the amount of water. Times that by 5, that's the amount of flour, etc. Okay, well, I think I'm done with this video. These little buddies. Oh my gosh. You guys, I hope I broke this down the best way I can. I'm not a micro bakery. I'm not some massive sourdough expert. I am here to teach you from my catastrophic mistakes I have made throughout the years. Oh boy, let me tell you. But yeah, that's what that is. And I hope maybe you are one of those that finally figured out you have to feed it 3 times or 2 times or just once. But yeah, that's it. That's feeding ratios. With that being said, may the odds forever be in your favor on your sourdough journey, and keep blazing your trail.